All right.
Welcome to a re-recording of our January 20th Local Civic Awareness Series. We would like to thank Erin and Maurice for joining us once again so that we can all know the difference between culturally responsive teaching and critical race theory. On January 20th, we attempted a Zoom conversation about this misunderstood concept in education. Unfortunately, the program was interrupted by Zoom bombers. The most disturbing part of the interruption were the racist comments that were directed at one of the presenters. The fact that this happened to our guests, who are respected educational leaders in our community, confirms to us that the cultural awareness and tolerance is needed now more than ever. We all must be vigilant and committed to speak out against hatred and intolerance to create a society where we respect and trust one another. When the actions and words that we heard on January 20th continue to flourish, it truly diminishes each and every one of us. There are no reasons or excuses for racism. We must be better. Now, I am honored to once again introduce Dr. Erin Groth, who has been a high school science educator for over 20 years. She currently works as the science department head at Addison Trail High School, where she also serves as culturally responsive teaching and learning instructional coach. Dr. Groth has a doctorate degree in educational policy with a focus on diversity and equity in education, and a research focus on developmental and radicalized trauma and its impact in the classroom. Maurice McDavid is an experienced educator who has served on the Diverse and Learner Ready Teacher Network, a subcommittee of the Illinois State Board of Education, since its inception in 2018. As a member of the DLRTN, Maurice helped to author the Culturally Responsive Teaching and Learning Standards for the state of Illinois. He is still actively serving on the committee with the second goal of working with institutes of higher education to diversify teacher pipeline. Maurice also serves as principal in West Chicago's Elementary District 33, where he serves a dual language K-5 building. His fight for equity extends beyond the school day, as he and fellow educator also co-host a podcast called Black, Brown, and Bilingüe that endeavors to bring unity and uplift the voices of Black and Brown communities. He's married to his high school sweetheart, who also works in education, and they have 3 elementary-age children. Welcome, both of you. And Maurice, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you again. We definitely want to just offer thanks to Barb and to Judy for the opportunity to talk about this really important topic, and certainly an opportunity to come back and re-record in order to make sure that this is something that we can get to as many people as possible. Definitely very much so aware of this conversation that we're having today, and I think that it's worthwhile. Also, definitely want to say that it is a pleasure to have gotten a chance to work with Dr. Groth, Dr. Groth, on this project as well, as we will present tonight. So we do want to take just a moment here at the beginning and talk a little bit about critical race theory, and really just to set up. We know that there was some time spent, I think even on the 13th of January, some time spent with a professor talking about that in detail. So we won't spend too much time there, but then we'll also look at the CRTL standards, and then how they're being implemented in schools, and move forward from there. So a little bit about critical race theory. I like to always begin this conversation by simply saying that I'm somebody who has gone K through 12 public school, got my bachelor's degree at a small liberal arts college, Knox College down in Galesburg, Illinois, and then have earned my master's, and I'm currently working on my superintendency certification, and then will continue on to my EDD. And what I can tell you is that throughout all of that study, I have not had a single class on critical race theory. In fact, I didn't talk about critical race theory until this year when everybody on the news started talking about critical race theory and about how it was in public education. Well, again, this is year 12 for me in public education, and I've served as a paraprofessional, and now I'm serving as a principal, and I've done all of those jobs. And at no point have we talked about or taught critical race theory. So I want to start with that, right? But I'll add that what critical race theory is as it's mentioned in the word or phrase itself. It is a theory that comes out of law, was originated in legal studies. And basically, it is a lens through which you can look at different legal situations that simply says that race has, throughout the history of this country and still does today, play a role in how laws are articulated, how they impact the community. And so again, it's a high level concept. It's not something that we are talking about in third grade social studies class. I'll let Dr. Groth kind of add in here too as well.
Yeah, thank you again for allowing us to be here tonight. I will just very briefly reiterate what Maurice has said. I've been in public education for over 20 years, and I've never taught critical race theory. I myself have been to K through 12 and never learned about critical race theory all the way through my doctoral program. A few years ago was the first time I was introduced. It was a program that focused on diversity and equity in education. So it made perfect sense for critical race theory to be laid into the coursework. And that was the first time I was introduced to it as a student. Again, it is not something, it is a very complex and important theory that is not something that's applicable to a K through 12 education, unless you have a beyond exceptional child who is learning legal law theory in elementary. It just doesn't happen. And that's not to, and I worry when we frame it this way, that it kind of suggests that it's not important. It is very important. However, it is, as Maurice said, a very complex system of ideas about how race is pervasive and racism is pervasive in our society. And it's just not done in K through 12. So I will let Maurice carry on with his important work.
Yeah, I would add just one more thing to that. I would say it is important to kind of think about this idea that critical race theory and the teaching of Black history are not one and the same. And I really want to emphasize this as we approach February, right, which is Black History Month. And you can't talk about Black history in our country without conversations of oppression and systems, but they are not one and the same. And so I think there's things to be celebrated. There are things that we can talk about that we have overcome as a nation, but they are not one and the same. Now, what you will see in schools is culturally responsive teaching. And in particular, the culturally responsive teaching standards. I will take just a moment here, and I want to just take you kind of along the journey that we have been on to see the Illinois culturally responsive teaching and leading standards come into fruition. So what you'll see here on this slide, I always love this picture because I think it well represents the group that was called together to do this work. And so I also kind of attempted to include somewhat of a timeline. In 2018, the Council of Chief State School Officers launched the Diverse and Learner Ready Teacher Initiative. And so this was a collection of states who had decided that they really wanted to emphasize how they could make sure that their diverse students were achieving at the same rate as their white middle class or upper middle class students. So at the end of it all, what ended up happening, right, is that Illinois kind of was the last state left standing. And so Illinois then formed the Illinois Diverse and Learner Ready Teacher Network. And I was fortunate enough to be able to serve on that initial committee. We got together and we came up with a few goals, the first of which was to create the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. We looked at states, other states that had already created them, such as New York and Alaska and Washington State. And we looked at those standards as somewhat of a basis, right, of what we thought we could create here in Illinois. And again, we emphasized that these would be standards that would be used for teachers, right? That these were not standards that we were expecting students to meet, but instead this was about being a culturally responsive teacher. And so as practitioners, we would get an opportunity to review those standards. When the standards were finally written, they were sent into the editing process, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the changes that were made along the way. But there was some pushback, and I can point to really one video in particular where basically someone who had an internet show called these super woke standards and threatened that teachers would lose their job if they did not fall in line with the liberal agenda of culturally responsive teaching. However, some folk more closely related to education got involved and began to write some responses. So Maurice West, who's a representative in Rockford, Illinois, a state representative, Josh Kaufman wrote an op-ed. He is the director of Teach Plus Illinois. And then Bill Curtin, who writes for the Southern down in, and I forgot this last time too.
Carbondale.
Carbondale, man, there we go. Carbondale, I always want to say Champaign. So down in Carbondale also wrote saying that connecting with students isn't political, it's just good teaching. And at the very root of culturally responsive teaching, it is that concept of connecting students, engaging students, challenging students, causing students to push to a higher level of success. So the standards were sent through to JCAR, which is a subcommittee that basically it's called the Joint Committee of Administrative Rules. And it is a committee of legislators that then allow ISBE to pass something through to rule. And they were passed through in February of 2021. I want to get into the standards here, but I'll quickly just kind of give you a little bit of a background. They were passed in February of 2021. However, they are not mandated to be implemented until 2025. And they are, again, standards that are for teachers. And in this case, they're actually they're mandated for institutions of higher education or teacher prep programs are going to be asking their teacher candidates to be meeting these standards. So there actually is not a current mandate connected to teachers who are already practicing. However, we're going to get a chance to hear from Dr. Groth, and she's going to talk a little bit about how they are being implemented in her district. And I'll chat a little bit about how we're using them in my district. So I'll quickly run through the standards. There are 8 of them. And in the standards themselves, they're listed by letter as opposed to number. Why they did that, I don't know. But nonetheless, the first one is self-awareness and relationship to others. And that is simply asking culturally responsive teachers to understand their identity and the impact that their identity has as they move through the world on their students, whether those students maybe look like them or don't look like them, whether the parents that they're speaking to speak their language or don't speak their language. All of these things are things that a culturally responsive teacher is going to do. Now, this second one is one that perhaps received a little bit of pushback because it does share some language that you'll hear in other areas of study. But systems of oppression, this standard simply asks culturally responsive teachers and leaders to understand that there are systems that reinforce or that are unfairly implemented, right? And so that the impact of that system, of that law, is not distributed equally across the population. And so when a culturally responsive teacher understands that and actively works against it, they understand that poverty, for example, has an impact on the students sitting in front of them in their classroom. Culturally responsive teachers are also going to see their students as individuals, right? Understanding that even though a culturally responsive teacher is not going to be colorblind, they also are not going to be color collective, right? And say, well, if this child is Black, then that means this blanket statement is their experience, but instead understanding students as individuals. Fourthly, culturally responsive teachers are going to see students as co-creators. And this is incredibly important because we understand that learning happens not to a student, but happens with a student, right? And so that students simply are able to be partners in the learning environment. The next one is leveraging student advocacy, and I'll simply point out this actually used to be called student activism, but there was a sense that the word activism tended to have a political leaning, which I struggle to understand because we have activists who are conservative and activists who are liberal and all of these things. Nonetheless, the purpose is advocacy, getting our students to understand that they can use their learning to advocate for making the world a better place. And that's such an important message to get to our students. Our next one is a culturally responsive teacher is going to understand family and community and is going to collaborate with them. No student comes into the classroom empty of context, right, of cultural and community context. And so a culturally responsive teacher is going to understand the context in which they are teaching and is going to use those things in order to collaborate with family, community, and students. Our last two are the things that I think typically are what's thought of when we begin to have this conversation. These are things that tend to be a little bit more surface. They have an impact, but they're a little bit more surface. And so oftentimes when we start talking about being culturally responsive, people want to jump right to, oh, well, you know, I want to make sure my books have characters that look like my students. Well, yes, that's part of it. But in terms of content selection, a culturally responsive teacher is going to be sure that they're providing both windows and mirrors. So mirrors allowing the student to see themselves reflected in the curriculum, but also windows allowing the students to see into someone else's world. And some folk will take it a step further and say sliding doors, which allow them to move that to the side and step into that world that is different than what their experience has been. Student representation in the learning environment is really key. Who are the heroes that are celebrated on the walls of your school building? Right? Who are the people that are put forward? In fact, really a step beyond, again, the teachers, the staff, all of those, right? How do they reflect all of your student body? And again, how do they reflect even those that perhaps are not represented in the student body, making sure that our students get a wide and diverse opportunity to learn. So I've kind of run through those, but that's because I don't want to take all of your time, but certainly if you're interested in more information, these standards are available online. But I want to turn things here over to Dr. Groth.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Maurice. Thanks so much. I may have a little trouble. I've been having trouble advancing the slides, so I may be giving you a wave to help me out there, Maurice. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the process of generating these standards and then what they are, obviously. But now let's take a look at how they are actually implemented within the schools. And as Maurice alluded to earlier, these standards were written for implementation in 2025, primarily to be focused on for teachers who are learning to be teachers, teacher candidates. But knowing this inside the schools in which we work and spend our days, we know that it's great to have teachers coming in with this context and this knowledge, but it's also equally important to have our current teachers be knowledgeable around these topics, because they're the ones who are currently seeing the students every day, interacting with them, and building their educational experience. So as we walk through this, I've kind of divided the standards up into 4, what I want to call pillars. And knowing that the students don't do this alone, the teachers don't do this alone, we need a network of collaboration for true, authentic learning to take place. So I'm going to start here with the teacher. And this kind of, once again, reiterates what Maurice has already talked about. The expectations of a culturally responsive teacher is that they are going to take an active role in understanding themselves. And why that is important is because we have to be self-aware as educators and understand who we are, the space that we hold in society as we walk through our communities, our families, the space we hold there, but then also the space that we hold in the school setting. Who am I in this building? What power do I have and how do I use it? So self and knowledge of self is incredibly important in any equity work. Teachers have to understand their own biases. And it's important to note that everybody has biases. The way in which we are inundated with media, our own life experiences, etc., give all of us a set of biases. Our job is to identify them and then work to negate them. We also have to understand the influence we have as the leader of the classroom. What kind of influence do I have over these students that I spend time with every day? Key to this concept and to learning as a whole is that students in the classroom feel a sense of belonging. You will not have authentic learning taking place in a child who feels as if they don't belong in that room, in that building. So a teacher who is culturally responsive understands that and works as day one, making sure that every child feels as if they belong. And then finally, we use the word teacher a lot, but I really prefer the idea of a facilitator. My job is to facilitate learning in my room, and I do that by building relationships. I do that by making sure every voice is heard, and that making sure that everyone feels that they are a part of our learning collaborative environment. So I facilitate the learning. It's not me just handing out knowledge to those I deem worthy. Every person there is important, and we build on that learning environment together. Our next pillar then would be the student. I mean, obviously the student is playing a huge role. We wouldn't be doing this if we didn't have our students. In the context of what a culturally responsive teacher knows about their students is that we have to value them for who they are, not who we want them to be, but who they actually are. And it takes work to understand that. We don't just walk in the door knowing who all of these students are. We have to make an attempt to get to know them. We also need to encourage them to share their life experience, what they walk through the doors with, their family contexts, where they live, etc., are all very valuable to their experience, and it adds to our narrative in the classroom. The classroom narrative is not just my narrative, it's every single person in that room. We also want for our students to advocate for themselves to be seen and heard in the curriculum, to give our students the tools to be able to recognize when they do see themselves, but also then when they don't. Going back to valuing our kids, we want them to be free to be their authentic self. I don't want my students to have to code switch, to come into my room and change who they are just to conform to my expectations. I want them to be able to be free to be their authentic self in my room, because again, that brings their level of fight or flight down. When they know they can be themselves, their brain can rest a little bit and absorb the knowledge. And then we also want our students to learn about their own cultures, exactly what Maurice said earlier in terms of mirrors and windows. Yes, we absolutely want them to learn about their own culture. Every student should learn about their own culture. But we also want them to learn about the culture of others as well. As a parent of 2 white children, yes, I do want my kids to learn about white history, but I also want them to learn about everybody's history, because it makes them a better global citizen to learn about everyone's history, not just, you know, the white men that they may be used to learning about or reading about in books. The next pillar is that of systems. And Maurice talked about this a little bit already. We know that we have systems in our society that place particularly minoritized groups at disadvantages. We know that there is not equity within all of our systems. And so a culturally responsive teacher is aware of those systems, is educated on those systems, and then works to dismantle them within that educational setting. We are not about, you know, setting up barriers to access knowledge. We are about removing those barriers. And we can only do that when we understand what those actually are. So that is very important in terms of that pillar. And then finally, a huge part of the equation would then be the family and community coalition. We know that community as a whole, as well as parental engagement, is the backbone of our schools. What our parents bring to the table in terms of support, their own traditions and belief systems, the way in which they you know, keep their home and raise their children, all of those things are part of what kids bring to school, and we embrace that and we see that. And so when we have community and parental engagement, that provides that extra layer of support for learning. When we have schools embarking on a working relationship with parents and communities, it really helps us to have higher engagement at all levels of our school networks. From school board to people attending events to collaborations between, and I know Maurice experiences this in his community as well. When the community is engaged and it works with the schools, we see opportunities like job fairs taking place in the school. We see businesses coming in and supporting our activities. All of that leads for significant amount of engagement, important engagement for our students and for the community. Teachers who are culturally competent understand how important that role really is and how it can help move us forward in our educational setting. And then finally, when we need to troubleshoot and find extra areas of collaboration for student support, having that parental input and collaborative relationship is really, really important. When a student is struggling and we have the parental support so that we can troubleshoot those issues together, that really builds for a much stronger support network. And especially when we can couple that with networks we have outside that can also layer on support. So all of those pillars working together is what a teacher who is culturally responsive and teaching and leading has to kind of understand all of those relationships and understand that us being knowledgeable about all of them and accessing all of them is what leads to the most robust support network we can build for our kids. And so we have a few key takeaways here. And I know Maurice and I will kind of ping pong back and forth here at the end to kind of throw out some of our remaining ideas. As we've said, critical race theory is really important, but it's just simply not taught in K through 12. So when you hear that verbiage, that it's not true. It's not happening. These standards were created to make sure that all of our students are seen and heard in our curriculum. That's the bottom line. We want to hear and support all of our kids. And as this argument has kind of evolved, it's been kind of, you know, narrowed down to simply race. But it's important that we understand that these standards are not just to make sure that we are supporting our students dependent upon their race, but also we're talking about gender issues. We're talking about sexual orientation and religion and ableism. This encompasses all of our children, not just Black and brown students who we know we have to work to support, but we're not just speaking about race when we talk about being culturally responsive. We know that students are more equipped to learn when they have a sense of true belonging and authenticity within our buildings. And we also know that successful schools are going to incorporate this entire network from teachers, students, parents, community, and culture, all working and being intertwined together.
Yeah, I will just quickly add in that, and you'll hear several different ways that cultural responsive teaching is talked about: cultural responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive instruction, or culturally competent instruction. And one of the things that I really would just share with people is cultural responsive pedagogy, as it was labeled by Gloria Latson-Billings. Her research started back in the 1980s, and basically the whole model was that she was looking for who are the people having success with students who have traditionally not had success in our public schools. And then she found the people that are doing that, and she created this idea of, okay, what is it that they do that's bringing success? And she labeled that collection of things that they do culturally responsive teaching. And so at the very root of culturally responsive teaching is academic success, right? And so I want to emphasize that, because it's not enough simply to try to have children, Black and brown children, or impoverished children, or you know, children of varying sexual orientation who have traditionally struggled in our public school system feel good. It's not enough just to have them feel good. Culturally responsive teaching is about having them do well. And so that is why there is a push. If we do nothing, then that system that we talked about will continue to perpetuate and produce inequities in outcomes and opportunities. So that's why culturally responsive teaching.
Wow.
I think that's the perfect summary right there.
Thank you both. I'm so glad we got an opportunity to do this again. And I applaud you both for your work. And I'm going to turn the meeting over to Judy. Okay.
Okay. So did I just?
Oh, once again, Judy. There you go.
Okay. Well, yes, thank you to Mr. Maurice McDavid and Dr. Erin Groth for making us smarter about culturally responsive teaching. We are so grateful you shared your evening with us, actually another evening with us. So thanks so much. And good night. Okay, I don't know why I've lost my screen.
Well, we can always.
Okay, I'll stop